Good evening and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm personally very pleased to welcome to the program Richard D. Heffner. And Mr. Heffner is the host of what I believe is the longest running television talk show in the country. And Richard Heffner, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I think I read recently that you've been doing the Open Mind for now over 31 years, is that correct?
Well, the program began in May 1956, so it started 31 years ago plus.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I think it's old enough to be congratulated.
Indeed. And you've been doing this within the television medium and having a great number of concern with television. The people that you've been interviewing over the years have tended to be, some people have called your program a seminar. It's intellectually oriented. People talk in long bites. There are long considerations, thoughtful considerations. And many people look at television and they feel it's too many fast bites and so forth. I wonder how you feel generally about television as a medium for the expression of thoughtful, philosophical, intellectual perception, if you would, as a medium, and what the tendencies have been over that 31 years in terms of the industry itself or the medium, and what the likely prospects are for television for serious intellectual affairs such as you yourself have presented to us.
Well, certainly it has been a fast bite medium. My friend Neil Postman has written about the impossibility, as he has viewed it, of doing anything terribly serious a la print on television. And yet when Neil was on the Open Mind, I asked him what he was doing there, if indeed, in fact, one couldn't accomplish something worthwhile on television. One can.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, too many of us have had a tendency of saying nothing good can happen on television. Let's make it clear that television is essentially an entertainment medium. Back in the 1920s, when Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce and radio came into being, the notion that radio would be anything other than part of a university, the notion that there would be commercials on radio, that was horrifying.
Interesting,
for
yeah.
Herbert Hoover. The very fact of the matter was he saw it only as a university. We've made it into something else,
Yeah.
a commercial entertainment. And yet, if one is willing to take the time and search out through a television guide of one kind or another, I think you can find more than enough to satisfy any inquiring mind on the medium. Now, that means any one individual searching through what's offered at any one day, any one week, will find more than enough. But in terms of the programs that receive major attention, that have the largest possible audiences, it wouldn't be just wouldn't be acceptable to think in those terms.
Yeah, it isn't as though there's certain qualities to the medium itself, as a perceptual qualities that Marshall McLuhan pointed out to us and others, that argue against the kind of linear, conscious perception that phonetic alphabet tends to be, and our society tends to be organized along the metaphor of the phonetic alphabet and literacy. But it isn't as though there's a necessary bias in terms of the medium itself.
Well, I think one can make that point, and McLuhan did. He said at one point in Understanding Media, he referred to a statement made by General Sarnoff about NBC and what it was doing. He said, General Sarnoff should know better than to talk about the content of the medium, because what really counts is the way the medium massages our minds, and as you suggest, it does so in a way that doesn't comport with our traditional linear, rational, reasonable approach to things. Yes, I'll agree that by dint of the nature of the medium itself, excuse me, it is not conducive to the kind of linear thinking that we've identified with print in the past. Still, I would continue to put my emphasis upon the content of the medium rather than upon the medium itself. And I think it does. It can do a hell of a lot better.
Yeah.
But it does do. It does bring us a great deal of worthwhile content even now.
It does, and it has, and it's a relatively new medium. These media all build one on the other. They come through time and so forth. So you want to get a sense of history about these sort of things. It's a major influence in terms of dissemination of information. Greater and greater numbers of people gain their sense of reality, the news, and other kinds of things from the electronic media and so forth. Other people are very disturbed by the tendency, particularly among some of the younger people, toward increased illiteracy, just in reading terms, and also in terms of just a store of common knowledge that some of history, geography, and other kinds of things that many of the young people seem not to be having. There have been some books on the bestseller list to that account and so forth. Many people would tend to put that on television. The blame for that sort of tendency that they see on television?
On the Open Mind recently, Alan Bloom.
Oh, yes, right, of course.
The closing of the American Mind participated in a discussion on that. And of course, as you suggest, he in turn suggested that television had a good deal to do with this growing illiteracy. It probably has, but what I think is more important is that the 21st century aborning has a great deal to do with our growing illiteracy, and television is simply one of the avenues to that next century. We're not the same people we were at the beginning of this century or in the middle of this century. We've changed. We've
changed radically, then, in a sense, in a different kind of historical frame than we have throughout this the national or the human experience. You're a professor of history.
Well, you may remember that at the beginning of television there were those various books and claims and cries that soon we would be Cyclops-like. We'd simply have an eye in the middle of our foreheads to concentrate on this medium, the beady red eye of television. I don't know that that's happened, but I wouldn't deny that a focus that we've placed upon audiovisual materials has led, obviously, to a decreased involvement with print. Now, I'm sorry about that. I'm a print person. I'm a pre-McLuhanite.
Yeah, most of us are that are a little old or have a little more experience. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that the 21st century will be an audio-visual century.
That's interesting, yeah.
And books and print will not play the role they played, as McLuhan pointed out to us, in this century or in previous centuries. We're past the age of Gutenberg.
So it may be that these children, as it were, will be leading us in the right direction in a certain sense? Or perhaps their perceptual mode is one that is appropriate to the 21st century aborning, as you put it?
I'm afraid that's true. I say I'm afraid because it's not part of my apparatus. My perceptual apparatus molded, massaged, formed in the age of Gutenberg by print.
Yes.
And of course I can't appreciate the nature of this new world aborning in which television and the beady red eye play such a major part. But don't forget, we have been saying that to the younger people ever since the dawn of history.
True.
We've been ideming about every single technological development. And I'm not convinced that we won't survive this differently, but that we will survive it. And there is a different kind of literacy, a television literacy, an audio-visual literacy, if you will. I can't embrace it. I belong to the older age. But I don't think we should underestimate the power to survive of the newer audiovisual literates.
Or perhaps it might be well for some of us who are more literate to be able to be more appreciative of the grammar of the audiovisual or of the other kind of a perception that maybe some of the younger people are trying to tell us again.
It's not very likely that we will be that open-minded.
Yeah, you know, we should, even despite the open mind would still be on perhaps to help us lead us in the direction of where an open mind could lead us toward the truth in some sense. We're doing, I understand there's Kurzweil, Raymond Kurzweil now has an electronic typewriter that has a voice-activated 10,000-word vocabulary, so that, and it's touted as a precursor to the audio accessing. You can talk and have script come up, but it's also a precursor to the audio accessing of database information, so you wouldn't even have to keyboard through the alphabet, which would seem to play hell increasingly on literacy or the stringing out of ideas in a phonetic literate pattern. You do see that as something that inevitably is coming, that we're moving beyond a literately oriented culture?
We're moving beyond a print-oriented literacy. But literacy is a word, I think, that can be used not only in connection with print, but in connection with any way in which we learn to communicate satisfactorily with others. And to say that we're no longer going to be as print literate as we have been is not to say that we are going to be primitives, is not to say that we're going to be uncivilized. Just different.
Different.
I'm glad I'm not going to be around.
Really?
Different.
You're glad you're not going to be around for that kind of, maybe back to the Bardic tradition, more oral communication as opposed to written? Or
McLuhan made the point, of course, that in the global village, the electronic communications media will make us different kinds of people. And as you suggest, the linear patterns that have to do with the logic of reading from right to left or left to right, choose it, going down a line,
one
coming
thing
back,
at a time,
one thing after another. A kind of reasonable, rational, logical approach to life.
Came in with Plato.
That's gone.
And Plato would have banned the poets from the Republic, I believe, maybe because they had an audio, or they had a poetic perception of reality. I don't know, but you said earlier, if I may, you said earlier you're glad you're not going to be around. You well may be around with the program come the turn of the century and so forth. Are you generally optimistic?
No,
or do
no,
you
no,
sometimes
no.
wax
I'm a
pessimistic?
child of the Depression.
Yes.
And of the Second World War, the Great World War. How could I be optimistic? No, I'm not. And optimism is called for. And I don't think that the future is going to be in the hands of old fogies like myself, but in the hands of those people who can adapt to the major modes of communication as well as the major modes of production and personal exchange of the future.
We said earlier that there's this change coming, the rate of the technological change is almost exponential now.
It is.
There is a new discovery and a synergistic discovery that makes change so much more rapid than it has been at a more reasonable time frame throughout history. Do you think that we'd reach a Doppler or some sort of an effect where we're going to have a qualitative transformation or some sort of a breaking into some new do we live at a time of qualitative transformation, of major change that we can sense is characteristic of this dawning generation now?
Well, I'm sure that's
everyone
true.
said that probably, but
Adam said to Eve, we're in a state of transition,
Yes.
and we've been saying it to each other ever since. Sure, the answer is yes. Do we have to say this is bad or this is good? I don't think we have to say anything other than that it is, and that those who will move from our period to the next will speak a different language, will think in different ways. Now, whether we can preserve what is best in our times into this newer 21st century, I don't know. I'm not an optimist. I don't really feel that the humanistic values, if you will, that our generation has embraced, that previous generations have embraced, will necessarily prevail in the new century. But you know, I can think back to the time when we were living toward the beginning of this century, and now we have to start thinking in terms of the next.
yeah, it's coming so quickly, isn't it? You might not agree with Daedalus. James Joyce had Daedalus say, history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken. You might not agree generally with that statement in terms of a historian or the
Well, the
great deal of suffering.
Shakespearean notion that we are but figments in the imagination of God, or part of a dream that God is having, and what will happen when he wakes up or she wakes up. Those are intriguing notions. What I'm most concerned about is that we be a little more understanding about the very nature of change, the necessity for change, and not quite so condemning of this movement from the Gutenberg galaxy to McLuhan's age of electronics. Doesn't do us any good in the first place.
I asked you earlier if you were optimistic or pessimistic, and you said pessimistic, and then you said the world of the 21st century. are you not so pessimistic as to think that we as a collective species may not, given the atomic, hydrogen, bacteriological, chemical warfare and the rhetoric of, some people say, history-bound geopolitical thinking and so forth, that we're going to make it to the 21st century, that there could be a conflagration that could threaten the species, which would be an ultimate sort of pessimistic reading of the Promethean capability that the human species has developed.
Well, remember that I'm a parent, and I hope to be a grandparent. And I don't find it possible to think in those terms. I don't want to think in those apocalyptic terms. If you describe point by point what we've done by way of creating the weaponry of self-destruction, of course you're right. It's just that I draw a line, and I don't choose to think in those terms.
Don't choose to think in those terms. All right, well, that's fair enough. I mean, but this is, again, a time of transformation. We could read these events, what they mean, in a more with a greater sense of continuity with the past, perhaps, than that these things will be growing. But there are going to be some of these tremendous developments that are going to be characteristic of the emerging 21st century. You're a historian. You're a historian and so forth. It's good for us to begin to think in futuristic terms. We have futurists, people who try to grasp the future, try to get certain ideas of the future toward which we can move, or is it something where there are just inevitably synergies that are appearing, or how?
Well,
how far can we plan ahead? Should we try to project ahead? And how much power do we have over the fates, as it were, collectively as a human society, to try and shape the world as you and I might want it, or have it for our children?
Even though I say that there are lines that I draw, and I won't let myself be projected into the dim, dark future, it's clear that we have to deal with that future. We have to make every effort, and you talk about the futurists, to spell out for ourselves what it is we're doing and what the consequences will be. And there is that profession of futurists that now are trying to, these people who are trying to map out for us what the consequences are. Let's say the impact of AIDS upon our society. The changes that they foresee are mind-boggling. I'm just a coward, am tired too, and therefore frequently say, I don't want to think in those terms, but the rest of society must.
All right, fair enough. Okay, fine. Well, I mean, okay, there's other things that we could talk about. We're talking again with Richard Heffner, and we're going to take a break now and come back. Maybe we can pick up on the theme and talk about some of the contemporary issues of the day and so forth. It's our pleasure to be presenting to you the perceptions of Richard Heffner of The Open Mind. Please stay tuned. We'll be coming right back. Thank you.
International Arrivals Terminal last night. The animals are now back in their cages, awaiting shipment to
television production at the Center for the Media Arts. Career training in camera operations, editing, and directing in our studios and on location. Interested? Attend our free career seminar. Call now, 212-929-6999. Classes are limited.
Center for Media Arts, right?
Yes, the Advertising Art and Design program.
Good design sense. Nice, clean comps.
In less than a year, you can start your career in commercial art with your own talent-filled portfolio. Interested? Get all the facts at our free career seminar. Call 212-929-6999. Classes are limited.
You are the third CMA graduate I've hired.
With Richard Heffner, and we've been speaking about the technology and some of the consequences of the, as we were saying, almost exponential increase in technological capability, and we've been speaking some about television as a medium. Television, computers, other kinds of technologies are coming along that perhaps could be used increasingly for educational purpose. Stephen Jobs has just announced a major effort toward trying to develop software that could be oriented toward questions of educational purposes. Do you think the technology could be used for better educational purpose than it has?
You know, at the beginning of television, back in the early 50s, the assumption was made that this was going to be the primary thrust of television, using it as an educational instrument. Why we have not done so, I suppose, is a function of the entertainment value of television, and that we have focused instead on the commercialization of the medium. But surely here is a medium that is a magnificent tool to be used for educational purposes. Remember back in the 20s and 30s when there was an assumption that this newfangled contraption, the 16mm projector, would be used in every classroom in the country. And indeed many were sold, but few were used. The word was then, because teachers were not willing to put their hands out and touch this machinery, they were afraid of it. Why we haven't used television sufficiently as an educational tool, I just don't know. It's unfortunate.
It's a very large question.
I mean, the growth of educational television, what is now called public television,
Yes.
has been, of course, a stupendous development in our society. But I don't think one could say that the medium is used sufficiently in schools themselves.
Schools and or universities, or
Right.
a lifelong learning, as it were, as much as they have. The British have gotten a fairly good jump on us in a certain sense. They have the British Open University with
Right.
telecourses that go in great depth and great, you know, with great scholarly expertise into various aspects of learning that is interesting that they've been able to get the jump in a certain sense.
Well, there
if
was
that's
the
the right term.
There was the fear in this country initially that the television educational process would be a substitute for teachers and teaching. And I do feel that many teachers were opposed to it because they saw the camera as a substitute for themselves. Therefore, I think the use of television as a supplementary instrument was not sufficiently well developed. And it's too bad, because it is a magnificent tool for teaching. And of course, the development of public television stations in a more public way has been a phenomenon of the past generation.
They also have in Britain, again, back to British, but in our public television, there is some public sector underpinning to the effort of television development programming, and, you know, in terms of hardware and development and so forth. In the United States, we've gone more toward a commercialization of the process, and it's been a very, very good business in a very real sense. People have been able to do very well in it. Do you think there's a role for public sector activity in terms of television and or technologically augmented educational facilities? We have a tradition of public sector activity in education that we don't have in others, and perhaps the private sector market-oriented forces don't serve so well in terms of...
Well, don't forget, again, I don't mean to keep pushing it, but we do have a rather major effort in this country in the area of public television itself. Many, many channels, developing larger and larger audiences constantly through the last decade or two, and quite successfully, too.
You've been involved in television, speaking with some of the great minds of our time in symposium and in dialogue, and have presented programming that many of us have. Thank you very much for having done that. The use of television in talking heads, or people talking back and forth and sharing that with a wider audience, has been extended out into the field of diplomatic relations and so forth. ABC recently did a Congress bridge where they had members of the Soviet and members of the Congress talking one to another. Can you see more and more use of television or these extended media for quasi, if that's the right term, governmental purpose, or involving the people in governmental activity of the societies in which they live, and perhaps extending beyond, if I may, to extend the question, I hope not too far, but beyond national limits necessarily of that? We're beginning to have systems where Soviet television is being brought into Columbia University and other universities here, but there could be a reaching out into this global village through television, around some of the nation-state walls and so forth?
There's no question about that, but the concept of direct satellite to home broadcasting is still to be developed. But it's been many years since the Soviets introduced in the General Assembly of the United Nations a resolution calling for prior censorship of direct satellite-to-home broadcasting, because they were so afraid that we, with our incredible capacity to touch the nerves of just about every person on the globe with our entertainment capacity, would dominate that field, and that we would be beaming into homes all over the world, including Soviet homes, willy-nilly, whether they liked it or not, the images that are conducive to support of the American system. They didn't like that, but the thing that concerned me at the time was that when that preliminary resolution was introduced in the United Nations, the first vote for prior censorship was 101 to 1 in favor of it. Ours was the only nation that said no prior censorship. And I think that's largely because of our great tradition of personal freedom. It's also perhaps because we knew that we would dominate.
Certainly would, yeah.
Whatever system of international communications would come to pass. And most of the other nations of the world seem to be saying, we don't want you to have the ability to beam into our homes, the homes of our citizens, anything you want to beam. But I think in terms of the question you asked, that is the future. A global village, which we are all tied together, having a system of communications that is no longer limited to one nation, but to the whole world as we know it.
It would be good to be able to receive television, as we do now, from the Soviet Union on some cable systems and so forth in this country, that brings us directly the programming that the Soviet citizens are seeing. Do you see that?
Well, I've spent enough time in the Soviet Union to know what most Soviet citizens are seeing, and dare say that what they see would not be of enormous interest to most Americans. Yes, on an academic note, or let us look to see what the Soviets have been told or are seen, yes, but to be equally entertained or amused or educated or informed, I would doubt that the heaviness of Soviet television would be conducive to the development of real numbers in this country.
The development of real numbers, that's again the question. I think it would just be interesting to be able, I guess what you're reaching for is to have a less parochial view of the world that American citizens might be able to have if they could have a better understanding of the view of the world that other peoples around the world do actually have. Right?
No, I'd be very much in favor of that accessibility, as you put it. No question about that. And you're right, Columbia University and one or two other institutions are capturing from Soviet satellites the images that they are projecting.
Yeah, so that they could have that kind of a view. This kind of thing in a quasi-governmental, the Congress Watch, the Soviet, other kinds of activities like that, you see more and more of that kind of thing being able to be done by the nations of the world. There would be more programming.
No question. Wendell Willkie wrote of one world 45 years ago, nearly 50 years ago. That's coming to pass thanks to a very large extent to our communications media.
Do you think this could be a precursor to an increasingly integrated, in a very real sense of the world, integrated cultural milieu for the peoples of the world, and perhaps following upon the increased internationalization of the economics of the world, that we will be coming to be less and less parochial, perhaps, than we historically have been throughout the nation-state era?
My answer would be yes, but I wouldn't follow up with the notion that that would necessarily be good.
Oh, okay.
No, I think there has been a great value to the decentralization of power and the decentralization of cultural emphases. But I think you're quite correct. There is no question, just as in this country, network television has diminished the possibility that local, regional accents will survive, has diminished the possibility that you can very easily tell a New Englander from a Westerner. I think perhaps it is still easy to tell a Southerner by his speech, but we talk American, we don't talk Southern any longer, or New Englandish, or Western. We speak American, we dress American. We look American and we act American. Now, is that a positive thing? I suppose in terms of developing a national ethos, it is. But it's too bad in a sense that we have been losing the regional identifications. And in the future, as you suggest, I think we'll be losing what are now the national identifications as we can reach out with the television medium, with satellites, and kind of obliterate those differences.
Yeah, that could be very, very a great cultural richness of the local view right on down to the New Guinean cultures that Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson struggled or studied and so forth. But that the inevitable march of technology is to homogenize.
Yes, wouldn't you agree with that?
It does seem that there is a loss to be lamented in terms of that, and yet it seems as though it is almost inevitable that such is the case. Can you see English emerging as a world language? I mean, it seems to be emerging in practical terms now, and that English will be spoken increasingly by the peoples of the world, again, presuming we find our way through and do survive the weapons in our midst and so forth. But
that certainly has been what has been happening. No longer French, but English.
English is the lingua franca.
Indeed. Indeed. That's what it is. There were those who may say, of course, that it may be Chinese, and those who say it may be Russian. But I would suspect, if I had to make a bet, that it will be English.
And this could be to the detriment and the loss of some of those local, national, as you put the values that you would lament. You know, it does seem to be something that's inevitably moving in that direction toward that kind of homogenization. It seems to be the course that we. Do you take general heart, and maybe I could ask you another question, a little geopolitically and so forth, in the alteration in terms of the Soviet Union? You've been there, you've had experience yourself. That seems to have come along on the ascension to power of Mr. Gorbachev, particularly his underpinning or voicing support for the underpinning of the United Nations, and perhaps making efforts toward what could be seen as a serious disarmament proposals that he seems to be making, or seems to have been picked up by so many in the West in a positive and perhaps optimistic view of what's coming out of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's a difficult one, because by definition one wants to be hopeful.
Yeah.
As I suggested before, I'm too ancient and have lived through too much of hot wars and cold wars not to be enormously suspicious. But at some point, as in the past, there have been points when suspicions proved to be deleterious themselves, stood in the way of progress. Younger, perhaps wiser people are going to have to deal with these questions. Those of us, I remember, for instance, looking out over Red Square, my first visit to Moscow, standing at the window of the National Hotel, looking out over Red Square, and rushing through my mind were all of those decades of our conflict with the Soviet Union. And I had to focus on that. And what an amazing thing it was that I was there. You can't wash those things away. And so when you ask about Mr. Gorbachev, my hope is that these are signs that are good and that will lead us all to embrace each other in peaceful endeavors. We have been burned often, and I think we will make the most of these developments if we remain somewhat skeptical, somewhat suspicious, if that isn't too strong a word.
Well, it's almost inevitable, given, as you say, the history. You're a student of history, particularly de Tocqueville, the American democratic history of the United America. The Soviet Union, much of the world would have been philosophically rooted with the dialectical materialism of a Karl Marx, and they read that. Despite the change, they tend to be seeing history in dialectic terms. One aspect of which some people have seen is that they see a change of history, if I can read it correctly, I'll just give you a comment, a change of history in terms of altering material reality, and one aspect of a change that they would have seen in the future would be the achievement of what is generally thought to be a material world of sufficiency or even surplus as a reality within which human institutions could be predicated and built. whether we have in a traditional capitalist view or the traditional historiography by which we read the Western civilization, a system that can have a reading of historical change that would be beyond the historical conditions of seeing economics as the allocation of scarce resources, or beyond the allocation, a world order based upon the general fundamental assumption of scarcity within which our human institutions have been formulated. Do we have a way to the future beyond that which we have historically been rooted in? If you can understand that the Marxian analysis would claim they do have, in a historiography sense.
It would seem to some students of the Soviet Union that the changes that seem to be taking place structurally and ideologically are based upon the notion that the controls that have always characterized the Soviet nation, have always characterized the Soviet system, have not produced the well-being, the economic well-being that they sought. And that indeed, as in China, so in the Soviet Union, there is a greater willingness to recognize the primacy of private enterprise to some extent.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's so, coming toward our traditional, yeah.
Right, and maybe that is exactly the point. It may well be that with all the goodwill in the world, if one can suppose goodwill on the part of totalitarian nations, what is required for productivity to develop and expand is individual freedom and individual initiative. We have thought that as a nation, and we seem to be closer to having achieved more than the Soviets and the Chinese. It is such a fascinating thing to see both of those great nations moving into the direction that we have taken for all these many years.
They're moving in that direction. Some people feel very sanguine in the fact that they are doing that. Some people are a little bit upset that the stock market just plunged 509 points. Ravi Batra and others are saying we may be in a mode where we could be heading for another depression and so forth. And I think that reading of of that would be on a world scale, that the technological augmentation on a world scale would be on such an order that would make possible a new world order based upon
well, listen, there are those people who are very unhappy about the newer developments, both in the Soviet Union and in China, the tendency to imitate, to some extent, our economic system on the grounds that they may prove to be successful. And there are those who don't want them to be successful, who want to see the collapse that has been predicted for the Soviet Union, certainly. And there have been economic hard times. They have suffered from the arms race perhaps even more than we have.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take, if we can, we'll take another break and come on, wind it up and bring it right up to the moment, if we could, in some of these geopolitical terms. And again, I remind you, it's your pleasure, the perceptions of Richard Heffner of The Open Mind. We'll be coming right back. Please do stay tuned. Thank you.
In our country, in Cyprus, this horror is reality. Since 1974, more than a third of Cyprus has been occupied by an invasion force from Turkey. We are a proud country. We have fought back every way we can, but we need help and understanding. We need you, people who love freedom, people who share our value of democracy.
And this country will be one again, and we will heal that jagged red scar that is across the body of this country.
I love New York. Health and Racket.
Back again with Richard Heffner, then, of the Open Mind, and we were speaking geopolitics and the Soviet Union and so forth. I wonder domestically, we did mention at the end of the last piece the uncertainty that some people saw in the drop of the stock market and so forth. I wonder the long-term health, the interconnectedness of the Western economies and so forth, what your feeling is about the prospects in terms of the continued health of the Western economies.
Oh, I think that's a question that's better directed to people who are more sophisticated and knowledgeable than I am.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
if you asked me before whether generally I was a pessimist or an optimist, I'm generally a pessimist. But I think there are those who are so much more expert, so much more knowledgeable than I am in such esoteric matters.
Yeah.
I'm one of those who say that my eyes glaze over when people start to talk about physics and or economics.
Along with Russell Baker, perhaps, who would watch the Wall Street Week, which is a very good program, but he gets confused when they're talking about Lunchables or something. He just misses it, I understand. But I mean, the point is that it's a thing, perhaps politically then. Do you think that there was just a report by the chief economist of Merrill Lynch today that the economy and the downturn in the economy that is going to be reflected in the by the time the election comes to bear gives it a tremendous in fact the term that was in the newspaper piece was that the Republicans won't have a chance to win the election because the per capita interest or the per capita fate, as it were, of the citizens of the United States is going to be at such a point where the Democrats are likely to win. I wonder, do you have any kind of predictions or thoughts about the likelihood of our next upcoming election about a year from now?
Let's put it this way, no one can do very poorly by way of the American public and expect to be embraced for that. And so, sure, bad times and the incumbents are in a bad way. But other than that, I don't think either you or I, either one of us is in a position to make an assumption as to which way the public will perceive that the economy is moving a year from now when we go back to the ballot box and pick a new president of the United States.
I think the bread and butter issues over the long haul from the days of the Depression and so forth, and you followed politics among other things that you've been concerned with and so forth, the bread and butter issues, the rate of increase of living standard perceived by the population generally of the nation is the deciding factor in terms of the election, apart from other broader foreign policy issues and so forth. It tends to be bread and butter issues.
I don't think there's any question.
Yeah.
I think historically that's been true, and I don't know of any example when it hasn't been.
Yeah. So that still is the major question of the economics is the major problem that the American people tend to equate in terms of the presidential election.
It's the thing they feel the most. The thing that's closest to them. Are things good? Am I making more money? Am I keeping more money? Am I more prosperous now than I was 4 years ago? The considerations of what's happening in the Soviet Union or in China or Nicaragua, I think those play a secondary role.
Do you think that kind of a lack of a concern, or that we were talking before about the loss of national identity and the cultural richness of the human experience and so forth that might be lost in a homogenized technological world and that sort of thing, that there is a negative side perhaps, or negative or a net loss side in a certain sense that provincialism can have if people are too narrowly self-focused, and that they could be more, I don't want to say idealistic, or more outreaching, or more seeing the interconnectedness of the system that is the human society of which they're a part. People can become too self-centered, perhaps in times when they feel fundamentally threatened in some sort of a way.
Well, I don't think that there's any question about that. If one, it depends upon one's view of the nature of human nature. And I don't think one has to be enormously cynical to say that the first thing we're concerned about is our own. And that concern is told in large part in economic terms. I don't think there's anything strange about that. I don't think there's anything outrageous about that. And I don't think there's anything novel about that. I'd say if you scratch a Soviet citizen or a Chinese citizen or a Briton or a Frenchman or a German, you'd find exactly the same thing.
Do you think that then if it's rooted in the genes, as it were, that the human species is, I don't want to use a loaded word, put it in quotes, a loaded word in the selfish and self-centered and so forth, that is part of human nature, and that the sociological, economic, geopolitical mix in which that individual is put does interface with that in some sort of way, or is it just that they're inherently selfish. I mean, the human
Well,
species.
it's your word.
No, I know, and I put it in
selfish.
quotes if I could have. But you understand what I'm saying.
I think we have there is a life force. We attempt to survive. And I think usually our attempt at survival is told in terms initially of feeding ourselves and our families.
Yeah, right, right. Even though we can realize that we are our brother's keepers. I mean, and that there is that. It's interesting that the human species is increasingly interconnected, particularly if only because of the Robert Lifton has written on the psychological trauma or the psychological effects, and I don't want to go back to a subject you like to keep closed yourself in a sense, but the weapons of destruction, that there is a psychological price that is paid, particularly on the part of the younger people, to know that such is a condition where the obliteration of not only yourself but all you love and your progeny and so forth is now able to be obliterated, that has a psychological rooting or an effect on the human consciousness and so forth. Do you think that there is, perhaps throughout the world, perhaps we don't look at it directly, but there is a psychological or sociological concern or sense of insecurity, fundamental insecurity about the condition of the world?
I don't doubt that. I don't doubt
in
that
a
for
new
moment.
dimension, perhaps.
Well, but I think what it does, it turns our attention away from the unthinkable. I don't think it's possible to live day by day thinking the unthinkable. And I feel that, I think it's true of my students, that they are not very much involved in what, if one is going to be rational, has to be the perception that we are on the edge of destroying ourselves. I don't think you can go from one day to the next carrying that burden with you.
Not only destroying ourselves, we've always had to confront death as an individual expression, an individual experience. We're on the verge of perhaps destroying the species, which I meant brought it into a more collective unconscious or a collective consciousness of this new rendezvous in universe and maybe the evolution of consciousness in this part of the universe.
In a funny way, it is such an overwhelming thought that I think, and we are so totally conscious of it, that I think we make ourselves unconscious of it. And I don't think I think it's the only way we can move.
Only way you can live
one
with
day
it. You got to go from the next because it could be so traumatizing if one were to really consider it consistently, but it just would seem that it might have to play a hand. It may be, on the other hand, that this might be the precursor to a new birth, back again to this notion that James Joyce had Daedalus say that history is a nightmare. A good deal of history has been on an individual level for many of the peasant peoples and so forth, a tremendous grinding struggle under various political systems. The bulk of the people were at the behest of pharaohs and whatnot, and that he said history is a nightmare from which we're awakening. If we find our way through to some new appropriate application of technology, it may be that the dawn of the era that's coming could be seen in very positive terms, almost liberating terms, in a way that historically is unprecedented, which would be the obverse side of the destruction. It doesn't necessarily have to be a destructive scenario. It could be a very liberating, almost birth-giving kind of era that we find ourselves living in, maybe like a birth experience to some.
But we are not even.
Do you understand? I mean.
Well, yes, but I think that we as a people are not even aware. If you raise it to more cosmic levels, I have to point out that I don't think we are in this country alone particularly aware of poverty, of grinding poverty. We are not particularly aware of those who live out of our line of vision, that we think of ourselves as an extremely wealthy nation. We think of ourselves essentially as fortunate. And those people who live below the poverty line or at the poverty line, they are beyond our vision. So that I don't think that we spend very much of our time thinking about people in other lands and other societies, or even less fortunate.
Or much less the less fortunate in our own society.
That's right.
But certainly that's got to be, in a certain sense, unfortunate that we do not be able to empathize. Maybe that's one of the crowning problems that we might have as a society. We can't identify with the underclasses, which New York City, they're increasingly hard not to see as they sleep on our streets and so forth. here in this country, there is crying need. Increasingly, the wealth is concentrating in the upper echelons of the society and so forth. If we have an economic depression, there could be a great growth of that. That we can't have an appreciation of or empathy for the underclasses of the world, or a system that can speak to that, might be a major sociological, political problem for the United States or for the West, if we just turn our back on that and don't have a system or a way of relating to it.
Well, there have been a number of people recently who have said there's nothing likely to be as healthy for us as the kind of whack right on the forehead that a further drop in the stock market, one leading to a real recession and perhaps a real depression, may give us. I don't think we have been alerted to the economic and the social problems within our own nation. I think it's been a long time since we thought in terms of the message that FDR gave us about 1/3 of a nation being ill-housed, ill-clothed, ill-fed. We don't think in those terms. Maybe we will if the troubles come as some people predict.
Perhaps we ought to think in those terms, and it would be the mark of real world political leadership, presidential leadership, to resonate to those needs, not only in our own nation, but to those of peoples around the world. Do you understand what it is? The mark of a real leadership. That back again to that question, whether we have a philosophical or a historical system that will permit us in some sort of way other than again, using all these mixed metaphors and so forth, selfish-oriented kind of trickle-down and so forth, which seems not to, that we don't seem to be able to resonate in a philosophical sense with the needs of the underclasses of the world.
Have you been able to identify that new leadership?
No, one would look for it, to that kind of leadership to emerge within the Western experience. Do you feel that such leadership can emerge out of the sociological condition or the political condition in which we look, or where should we
Why don't we
find
put our
such
emphasis?
leadership?
Why don't we put our emphasis upon whether such leadership must not develop, whether it mustn't develop, and it must, and that's what we need, I suspect, to survive. One looks around in this country for signs of it. I think I see it in Mario Cuomo. I don't see it in very many others. Whether that leadership will be exercised and help us through this period and take us on to into a better 21st century, who knows? But I think you're correct. That is what is needed. The vision that was supplied to us in the past by Franklin Roosevelt, by an Abraham Lincoln.
And we have a hard time seeing it. You've done a recently done interview, talked with Mr. Cuomo. Do you have some sense from that or from other experiences why he might have decided not to have tried to offer that leadership? It was such a stirring speech in the 1964 or in the 1984 convention. Do you think there is a chance that he's likely to be drafted and might be the one who could do it?
My bet is still that he will be the next president of the United States.
Really?
And I'm not very much of a betting man, but maybe that's a matter of wishful thinking. But I do think that he can be made available. I think it's the job of the nation to make certain that he is made available. At any rate, I think you're quite correct. Leadership is required.
And do you think it might be good? Some people have said Paul Simon, among others, has been able to go and strike a chord that rings true to the vision of Franklin Roosevelt and some of the traditions of the Democratic Party. I don't want you to try and say you're being partisan or anything of that sort or anything like that. You think it might be good if there would be political expression that could ring with the traditional liberal values that the Democratic Party in the era of Franklin Roosevelt and the intervention of the government into the marketplace and those kind of things might spell well for the future of our society? Or perhaps you don't want to comment?
No, of course I'd be happy to comment. After all, if I could have, I would have voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt. But I do think that the one who comes closest to offering the moral and the spiritual uplift that we need was Mario Cuomo.
And we do need that. Such leadership and so forth is primarily the result of the political, the industrial system as well, business leadership. Would it be something that would go throughout the whole, educational leadership? But it would come, the primary force for shaping the society is the political process, and the presidency is the political vehicle for shaping the nation. Does the nation shape the president? Does the president shape the nation? Are we, as we are now in the 1980s, as a result of having followed Mr. Reagan into that, or is Mr. Reagan reflecting the shifts that Arthur Schlesinger sees moving in the liberal democratic shift of the society, or
I don't
in
think,
these last minute or so?
I don't think there's any question, but the answer to that question is yes, both sides.
Yes, to both sides. Well, we could go on talking at great length, and you have. I'm sorry. I really do thank you very, very much for coming in and joining
Thank you
with
for
us.
having me.
It's a pleasure and an honor. And I want to thank you personally on my own behalf and for the many people who viewed the Open Mind over the long and distinguished career that you have behind it, to thank you really very, very much for all the great wisdom that you've brought to us, along with your own and the guests that you've been able to interview over those years.
You're very kind.
Thank you very much, and may it go again for another 31 years, as John Corey said recently. It's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Richard D. Heffner, host of the Open Mind, the longest running and, you might say, so most distinguished television talk show here in the United States and perhaps on the world scale. Our pleasure to be able to present his perceptions to you this evening. We invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week here on Conversations. That's it for this particular segment. We'll see you again next week. Mr. Heffner, once again, thank you very, very much indeed. Good night. We'll see you next week.
To obtain videocassette copies of this or other programs from the Conversations series, dial 1-800-367-2120. 1-800-367-2120. We welcome your comments. Send them to Conversations with Harold Hudson Channel, CMA 226 West 26th Street, New York, New York 10001.